Hello, my name is Paul van Lange, Professor of Psychology at the Vrije Universiteit. In this talk I'm going to talk about vitamin S. It's a concept that actually originated in COVID-19 because people lacked social contact. And then I asked myself, how important is social contact actually? And I reached the conclusion social contact is very essential to people's lives. In fact, when you look at social contact and vitamin S, it serves many functions. But also there's a very strong link between social contact and well-being. At a level of mental well-being, very important now, physical well-being and life expectancy. So for example, if you have a lot of friends and you have a lot of social interactions, you typically live longer than if you don't have a lot of friends. So the quality of your social network is very important to your mental, physical well-being and how old you become. Now, and when you make a comparison in terms of how strong this effect is, the effect is as big as not smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So it's a big effect. So you better have some friends basically and look for them than to be alone all the time. Of course, this is easier said than done, but it's important to realize. The effects are basically about social support. It's the idea that you feel supported by other people and that you are supported. It's both the perception that you feel supported and also that you have the support in terms of that people are motivated and willing to listen to you, to your problems, for example, that they have time for you and that they may give you, for example, a compliment. Now, what happens actually if we are excluded from groups? And this is a very interesting line of research in social psychology. Research by Kip Williams, who has initiated this line of research. Now, how can you study social exclusion, for example, in the laboratory? One of the paradigms, the methods that people have used is this specific method that you see. You see two figures, two little men, women maybe, throwing a ball to each other. But actually the little hand that you also see is you. And so the question is, at a certain moment, do I get the ball? And in this specific method, you get the ball in the beginning. So you are included. You're with the three of the people there and you get the ball and you throw the ball back to one of them and it's fun. You're all having fun basically throwing the ball to one another. But then all of a sudden the people exclude you and you do not get the ball anymore. What happens then, even in a little game like this? What we see is actually that this is hurtful to people and stressful. But what happens, for example, if you insert a name of somebody, like your mother, your father, your best friend, or perhaps your partner, somebody that you feel strongly attached to, if you insert that name in this video. Well, let's see what happens. Well, we looked at, for example, the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is a very important organ in your brain and it serves a stress regulation function. Basically, the hypothalamus is responsible for example, the increases in blood pressure or the increases in heart rate or increases in heart rate variability or, for example, the release of cortisol, all having to do with stress, the regulation of stress. So one could argue that if you are socially excluded, levels of stress should rise. Let's see what happens. Well, this is the situation. To the left you see the situation where there's no name. To the right you see a situation that there's a name. In my case it's Wilma because that's my wife. Now what we see is that if you are socially excluded, you see at the red bar, you see that there's a high level of activation in the hypothalamus, indicating a lot of stress. But if you are included, there's hardly any stress. So it's a big effect. Social exclusion leads to enhanced stress, even at the level of your brain. Now, when you look at the other figure, where you have a reminder that you are well connected with somebody, in this particular case, my wife, then you see that the stress is actually much less. And the levels of exclusion and inclusion do not differ anymore. So what you see is that Even very small forms of social support or even reminders of social support help you to cope with experiences of social exclusion. And I remember social exclusion is a very broad concept. It can mean, for example, that when you're waiting with, for example, other people and other people are talking to each other and you are not really included in the circles in which they talk. That could already be an experience of social exclusion that can lead to some discomfort or even stress. Or, for example, that in a meeting that people don't really listen to you, but they listen to others in particular. So anytime that you want to say something, people do not pay attention, for example. Those are also experiences of social exclusion that can lead to stress. But that kind of stress is reduced when you have a good social network and when you bring that to mind. Now, why is social contact so important and what type of social contact is important? And my theory about this is that it's very important to have one-on-one social contact rather than in groups. And why is one-on-one now so important? One-on-one in dyads, as we call it, is so important because it allows for reciprocity. You do something for me and I do something for you. It's very easy to develop cooperation and trust in the context of a dyad, in one-on-one interactions, simply on the basis of reciprocity. In larger groups, reciprocity becomes more unclear. Who did something for whom? There are people sometimes hide in the crowd, but in dyads, reciprocity is very clear and you benefit from it. Another reason is that in a dyad, it's psychologically safe. In a big group, you can be marginalized, you can be perhaps even excluded, that you are not a central member of this group. But in a dyad, people don't exclude you because then they would be alone themselves. Perhaps it happens every now and then, but typically this does not happen. So it's a psychologically very safe situation. You can also not be marginalized. And that safety is very important. Think, for example, of a classroom where people need to work together. Rather than that the teacher says, well, work on something in groups of 4, you could say, why not groups of 2 or dyads? Because then people are less afraid, for example, to ask a question, perhaps to raise an issue, because people, especially younger people, sometimes may fear that they are seen as somewhat less intelligent. And in the context of a dyad, that's the psychological safety that you have there is just very key and very important. And then there's a third aspect is empathy. Empathy is a very interesting emotion. It promotes helping, it promotes understanding, very important to social life. But in the context of a dyad, there's much more room for empathy, because empathy is inherently a dyadic emotion. We can have empathy for one person, but not for a group so much. Empathy is about, can I rescue, can I help this particular person? And then empathy may be activated. And empathy is especially strong when you see, for example, some slight suffering or severe suffering by anything that is one person or one animal and that is vulnerable. Then empathy is often activated and a strong guide to prosocial behavior. When you look, for example, at this picture, how many faces can you see at the same time? You actually cannot see all the faces at the same time. You probably are focused on one particular face, and that will determine whether you experience empathy or not. And so that's already a nice demonstration showing that empathy is guided by information, but it's often information about one particular person. Now, what do we get from others? Well, we get, of course, social support, we get the feeling of being connected. Roy Baumeister and Mark Leary have coined the concept of need to belong, a very essential motive that people have, or actually a need. But something that is also important when you interact with people is sort of a mental fitness. If you converse with people, if you communicate, if you social interact, you're actually constantly mentalizing. Your prefrontal cortex is often activated because you have to plan as well in conversation. So a lot of areas and networks in your brain are activated in conversation. And that's of course very important. You can do reading, you can do a lot of other things, but also through social interactions you become mentally fit. Especially in times of COVID-19, for example, it was therefore also important to keep social contact with people. But the interesting thing that, and this is more recent research in social psychology, you can also get those benefits not only from friends, but also from strangers. And this is actually an underused resource that we have in everyday life. We should actually interact more with strangers. Why, you may ask? What are the benefits of interacting with strangers? Of course, there can be risks, but typically, when you are in a safe situation, strangers can provide nice and wise advice. There's anecdotal evidence that some very successful people in life, that this was actually rooted in a social interaction with a stranger. For example, a person sitting next to you in a bus and providing you with some sort of a tip and advice for your life that you took to heart and then benefit from it. Those experiences are more common than you might think. Another one is no overlap in your network. Why do people tell their personal stories to a taxi driver or maybe to a barber? It's because they are not part of your social network. It's kind of safe to show your vulnerable self or your secrets to a taxi driver. But you don't do that with people that are part of your social network because they may spread it. But it's safe to talk to a taxi driver or a barber, typically. Unless you live in a very small village. Maybe then I would recommend not to talk to your barber. A third one is, if you talk to strangers, you're much more likely to meet and interact with people outside of your bubble. So you may receive some new insights, but also your opinions and your beliefs may be subject to some correction here and there. And that's also important. If you are interested in having a broader mind, it can be important to just think and interact with people that you do not know. And for example, there are some interesting implications of this as well. For example, in Amsterdam, a very nice city as we all know, when you go to a park, let's say the Vondelpark, well-known park in Amsterdam, the benches are situated such that you look at passengers, you look at people passing by. But you can also design those benches in a way, in an angle to one another, such that people are much more likely to initiate a conversation with a stranger. And that way you can even contribute to safety in a society. I also believe that, and this may be an overstatement, but I would like to share it with you because I think this is very important. As we know, there are so many bubbles in everyday life, and also we have prejudices and there are subtle forms of racism. I think that if you interact with people from other groups, other ethnic groups, other genders, etc., then actually in one-on-one you have a situation of trust, a situation of intimacy where empathy may be activated. And I think this may be a very powerful way to reduce or eliminate even your prejudices and all the judgments, quick judgments that we sometimes make. So I think it's actually beneficial for society at large as well. Okay, what are my conclusions? My conclusions are: stay in touch, especially one-on-one and especially face-to-face. There's always more benefit to face-to-face interaction than through interactions through WhatsApp or social media. So keep that in mind. It's very important, especially for younger people who spend too much time on their social media. Face-to-face interaction does have extra value, and it's very important, especially one-on-one. So stay in touch. And then a second one is, if I were you, when you're doubtful whether you should talk to somebody, I would say go for it. Talk to strangers. You never know what kind of good outcomes you may experience in the future. Thank you.